I am a big fan of Darcy Coates. I don't think I've really encountered a book from her yet that I have not liked. And so today we are going to talk about her newest, but yet not quite so new book called Ghost Camera. And I say it like that because Ghost Camera was one of the first stories that Darcy Coates ever wrote. She wrote this back in 2014, about 10 years ago. There had been a lot of people that apparently had reached out to her and been like, hey, where can I get Ghost Camera? Because they had discontinued that story and it was no longer in print. And so she decided to revisit this story, maybe tweak it a little bit, but it, at the core and heart of it, she says it remains the same, and it's part of a collection of stories. So we're going to talk about that collection today called Ghost Camera by Darcy Coates. The first story in the book is Ghost Camera, and it hits the ground running. It follows the story of this girl named Janine. Janine finds this camera in an old lighthouse at the very top. This old Polaroid camera from the 80s. And she's at her friend's wedding, and she's been taking some like action shots and pictures on the fly. There's an actual like hired photographer, so she's not an official photographer or anything. She's just getting, like catching people unaware, that aren't posed shots. So she goes up there to get like a cool angle and whatnot, finds this camera, takes a picture with it. It actually still has film in it. Polaroid pops out, she puts it in her pocket and forgets about it. When she leaves the lighthouse, there's this old man at the bottom who's super grumpy and is like pissed off, and he's like, you shouldn't be up there. And she's like, oh, hey, sorry, I didn't know. He's like, there was a little boy who died a couple years ago that fell off the top of the lighthouse. And she's like, all right, sorry, I didn't know. And he's already stormed off and like doing his thing and, whatever. So she's like, all right. So anyways, wedding wraps up. She goes home. Later on, she looks at the photo of the wedding party, doesn't see anything weird in it. That's that. But that night, she has a dream. And she dreams of this little boy that's in this photo that she took. She wakes up and she's all freaking out. And she's like, where's the photo? She grabs the photo, looks at it, and she's like, oh, there's no little boy in it. Okay, cool. But then she looks closer, and there are 6 ghostly figures. And so our story hits the ground running, and we're off. So you have, I believe there's 9 stories in this book. I had 3 that were my absolute favorites, and Ghost Camera was one of my favorites in this. I liked the variety that's in the book. You've got like your weird, you've got your deranged, there's a ghost story, there's sort of like a cryptid weird story, there's a like scary psychological story about when someone's brain ain't quite right, the way they view things and see things. And there's just a lot that I liked about this collection. My absolute favorite is not the namesake story. Like I said, Ghost Camera is in my top 3 for this. My favorite story in this is about a plane crash. So there's a plane crash, and that story is called Unnamed Things. It's about the survivor or survivors of the plane crash and how they survive, and they crash in this really isolated area. It's wintertime, and it seems that these people might not be alone. There might be some ancient and unnamed old creatures that are out there. I'm not saying it's Bigfoot, but it could be a Bigfoot type creature, maybe. Maybe not. Maybe it's a Wendigo. Maybe it is something we don't even know of. And it's a crazy story, and it's weird as heck, and I really, really love that one. And I also really loved the last story. And the last story, this lady moves into this house with her daughter, and in her daughter's closet, she finds this box of like old VHS videotapes. And this is like a common trope now for horror, or for, it makes me think of The Ring, box of VHS tapes, and it's like, don't watch them, you'll regret it. And you know what happens when someone's told not to do something? They want to poke the bear, they want to touch the hot stove, they want to do it. And so if this lady didn't watch these tapes, there would be no story. Come on. So she watches these tapes and seems to kind of regret it. If you like Darcy Coates, you are most likely going to like these stories. They're fast-paced. They are told in that typical, like, Darcy Coates pulling you into the story as per usual. That's the effect that she typically has on me. I haven't had a story yet where I was bored. So That's always a good thing to say, I guess, about an author. I wasn't bored. That's good, right? I'm curious if any of you have read the original Ghost Camera story, because I didn't start reading Darcy Coates until the last, couple years ago. I'm very new to her books, and she has a ton out. And so I'd be curious if people who had read it back then, when they read the new one, what the key differences are, what was tweaked, because it seems like supposedly it's supposed to be close to being to the same of how it was. But this is just a really good collection. It is dark, disturbing, there's glimmers of hope. And I think too, with horror stories, you have to have a little bit of hope in there, at least for me. Because if it's all just dark and death and no one survives, that's not a fun story for me to read. That in reality makes me depressed. And all these had a bit of hope. Well, maybe not. There was one that might not have. But it's in a collection. So you move on to the next one, and maybe the next one's a little more hopeful with all the darkness and terrible things that are happening. So yeah, you have, like I said, there's Ghost Camera. There is a weird story about gravediggers. There was this other story that's called the Deathbirds. I think it's called the Deathbirds. It's just called Deathbirds, not the Deathbirds. That one is so creepy, and it reminds me of a book I read a long time ago about some weird someone went to this other dimension where these creepy murderous giant birds were, and sort of brought them through to the other side. And that's kind of what it reminds me of, but they're not quite murderous. These guys just wait till you die and then they eat you. But when they appear, it's a bad omen. It's a precursor that somebody is going to die. And then when they do, the Deathbirds, they're gonna eat you. After that, you have a story about this mysterious house that, how sometimes you pass by a place that you'd never noticed before, even though you've lived in a certain area for years, and you're like, oh, that just must have always been there. Well, in this story, there's this house that appears, and people are like, I don't remember this house before, but how could a house just appear out of nowhere? It's weird because the windows are all open, and the doors are open, and it doesn't seem like anyone lives there. And it seems very inviting, and there's toys and different stuff in there. And at some point, all these kids that they'll pass it when they're going to school and whatnot, they decide they're gonna go in this house. Now, I don't know if something bad is gonna happen, but maybe. So there's that. There's that story. After that one, there's a story of these couples. They're on the beach. There's this old lighthouse, and there's this legend about this woman who had died on the beach. And that one's super creepy too. The story after that is called Remains, and it's a weird, messed up kind of psychological thriller about when this one woman's husband died. And oh, how much she loved him to death. After that one, there's the plane crash story. Then after that, there's a story called Cathedral. This couple, they're out kind of in the middle of nowhere, and they find this old, what seems to be abandoned cathedral. And there's all these weird, statues sitting in the pews when they go in there. And it's a strange and creepy story. And then the last story in this is the box of tapes about the VHS tapes that I had mentioned. So, honestly, I thought it was a fantastic collection. I had 3 that I thought were absolute bangers. Like I said, the Untamed Things about the plane crash, that was my favorite one. And I guess if I have to say 1, 2, and 3, I'll say that one, then Ghost Camera, and then the box of tapes about the VHS tapes. I hadn't read any short stories by Darcy Coates before, so this was new to me. Usually I read her books that are somewhere around 300 pages. So it's always interesting to see how an author does with shorter stories as opposed to a longer book where they have more room to develop their characters and stuff. But in each story, I felt the character development was good, and just the description and how you get into it, none of it felt lacking at all. They all felt pretty good, complete stories, and I highly enjoyed it. If you like Darcy Coates, I highly recommend it. If you haven't had a chance to check out Darcy Coates, here's a good spot to put your toe in the water. And yeah, I don't know. She's one of my favorites, so maybe I'm biased, right? I one day will probably stumble across a Darcy Coates book that I don't like. But until that time, I'm going to keep tooting the horn. I think one of my favorite Darcy Coates books is probably the book Haunted. That one's super weird about this girl who goes missing in the forest. and it's super creepy. If you haven't had a chance to see my video about that, I do have a standalone review for Hunted, and that will be the next video coming up. If you want to stick around, you can click into that. And if you enjoyed hanging out today, hit that subscribe button, come back, see me again, and we'll talk about more bookish things and weird stuff.